vision. But this is our Father's world, claimed by the new Lord Jesus Christ. Our task is to regain the biblical vision. That's the starting point for a confrontation with culture. Andrew, got some time for a bit of Q&A, I think.
So when you're talking about things like gender identity thought, it sounds like what you're saying is the thought that's prevalent now is not itself the problem, but a symptom of the larger problem, which is the loss of the Christian mind. So do you think it's possible to effectively confront the culture by confronting those symptoms directly?
Sure. So that's a good question. Seeing as what we're dealing with is a symptom rather than the root, how do you go about dealing with the problem? Now, I would say that with these sorts of things, because the only world that people can live in is God's created world, it's nonsense, right? It is a nonsense machine. And already what we're finding, and some research is now coming out on this, especially in England, is that people who have been raised in anti-normative home environments of same-sex unions, there is now empirical research which is demonstrating the damage that this is doing to people psychologically, emotionally. We're also seeing already now more and more people who've had sex change surgery wanting to reverse it. And so one of the things that's really important to remember when we have all of these discussions is that the Christian, we don't come with the antithesis to the world, right? We have the thesis. Our vision is thetical, right? This is God's world, it's God's creation, and this is really real. And anything else has to be a parasite. It has to try and piggyback on the real world. Okay, so even the idea of a sex change operation presupposes differences between the sexes, which the language theory is trying to deny, right? So you can try culturally to work against the real world, and you will always, if you jump out of a plane, you're not going to destroy gravity. Gravity is going to destroy you. You can't violate God's laws and norms with impunity. So that means there is actually a place for addressing the symptoms. I think in the medical profession, for example, and in the legal profession, when symptoms start to become clear of negative social results, cultural results, things can begin to be addressed. For example, a good example of that would be the flood of the pornification of Western culture. Pornography has become so ubiquitous that studies that have been done, or proposed studies to be done at certain universities in the West, to look to analyze the differences between the male mind that is not using pornography, or I should say the male brain not using it, and those which are regular users of pornography. They couldn't find a sufficient core group of non-users to actually do the study. And we now know that the effect on the brain is like that of cocaine. It's utterly addictive, and it stimulates the same reward centers of the brain, especially in men. And it actually leads eventually in young men to impotence in a real sexual relationship with a real human being. Now, that is becoming such a sociological problem that even in Scandinavia, they're looking at laws to try and get rid of hardcore pornography on the internet. So there does come a point when a culture moves in such an anti-normative direction that the results are so detrimental that you can actually get non-Christian people begin to engage with the issue. Because in the end, they live in God's world. It's a God-rigged world. It's God's world. It's his creation. It's governed by his laws and norms. And you can pretend otherwise, but eventually it's going to crush you. And that's the problem with Satan. He always overplays his hand, right, in an anti-normative direction. So we've got this systematic unbelief. So there is a place for us to address symptoms. But at the same time, I would say that you cannot have a long-term transformation. You cannot produce lasting change, and especially we see this in political life, without a change in the world and life view of the people. It's just a simple fact. You can change a law here and there, you can make a social policy different here and there, but you will not effect lasting change unless the root of the issue is dealt with. And that's why I think the primary challenge right now for Christians is not actually out there, so-called, in the culture. The primary challenge is with us in the life of the church. Because until we rebuild a Christian mind and act and live and function in terms of it, we can't see lasting change. Political life is downstream of culture. The politics has changed seemingly suddenly because the undertow of a radical transformation of world and life view and cultural life had already taken place. By the time they're changing a law in Parliament, the gods already changed in society. So that's the root that we have to deal with, and we must always be going after that root. And so I think in things like the abortion debate and the gender debate and sexuality debate, we need to be unashamedly and distinctly Christian. Doesn't mean we can't engage with the symptoms. We can, because we live in God's world, but we need to be distinctly Christian. Isn't it interesting that Muslims are not embarrassed about being distinctly Muslim? When they call for Sharia law or want to wear what they want to wear or have everybody prepare halal meat and everything else. But of course, that's part of the cultural Marxist agenda to say we live in a multicultural society, we can't privilege Christianity, so we're going to open up the entire cultural life space to a renovation by Islam in certain quarters, especially in Europe. It's much less of an issue here at the moment. So we have to be dealing with root and branch at the same time. You know, we need to lay the axe to the root of the trees, especially in the life of the church. And those who have competencies in these different areas of cultural life, in law, politics, medicine, education, and so forth, need to also strategically address symptoms from a Christian world and life view, even if people don't realize that's the perspective that's being dealt with. I mean, there is a way you don't have to wander around into every meeting with a Bible under your arm, you know. Now then, let's, deal with this properly. We can, just as Paul did in Acts 17, be informed in every area by a Christian world and life view without quoting Bible passages. So it's a root and branch issue. Other questions, comments, insults? There's a lady down here, and there's somebody. Was that with you as well? Was that? Or over here at the back? Okay.
We'll start with Armin.
Hello.
Hi.
This should be a pretty easy question. It's relatively straightforward. You mentioned the intellectual establishment seems to have influenced our children and of course your generation. What gives so much power to the intellectual establishment, particularly the 1970s onward?
So there's probably a few factors there. First of all, especially since the Enlightenment, the West was totally enamored with a rationalistic view of the world. And a rationalistic view of the world is one that fundamentally takes the lead from a mathematical understanding of reality and says that we need to think through everything in terms of these fundamental laws of causation. We rationalize everything. And that sort of began to privilege in the West an intellectual class. There's actually a really good book written by a Catholic historian called Paul Johnson called Intellectuals. I recommend that to you as a read. It's called Intellectuals, in which he, as an intellectual, is warning people about intellectuals. And he picks a hatful of the most noted and influential intellectuals of the 20th century and looks at the state of their lives and the fact that they had no basis lecturing anyone and no right to lecture anybody, and the outcome of their ideas. So his conclusion is beware intellectuals. But we began to privilege an intellectual class, which was a mistake in and of itself, to privilege theoretical knowledge over ordinary everyday knowledge. Ordinary everyday knowledge is much more reliable than man's theoretical ideas. Our theoretical ideas are changing all of the time as new things come to light. So you had that kind of privileging going on. That would be the first thing. And then as university education, if you think about it, became more and more popular, less and less people were going into trades, vocations, apprenticeships, and so on and so forth. And the state wanted to keep people in full-time education longer and longer. So they wanted your kids in kindergarten right through till 4 years of university. That's the ideal, because then you can reprogram a generation. I mean, the Soviet Union had this down. They knew that the key was to take children for as long as possible, for as much as possible, away from their parents. And the Ontario Board of Education has been pretty clear. I wrote them a letter some years ago. They regard the family as a poisoned environment. The parents are a problem. So you have to get children away from their parents with their bourgeois and heterosexual bias and their homophobia and everything else, and reprogram them in a state institution. So more and more emphasis was placed on education, which meant more and more privileging of this intellectual class. And this, with the 60s that you mentioned there, I did mention in passing yesterday a very, very influential school of thought, the Frankfurt School, with Antonio Gramsci and Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno and others. These were a group of European Marxist intellectuals that recognized the West could not be changed from the outside simply by an economic restructuring, but you had to you had to address the cultural institutions that gave shape and form to Western Christian culture, and you had to attack them from the inside. You had to ideologically subvert them. They ended up in North America, influencing a whole generation of students. You had the student revolution, the sexual revolution, that began in the universities, remember, at Berkeley, places like that. So it was, again, an intellectual movement. This is what Roger Scruton was talking about, the English philosopher. It swept through those institutions. And of course, those people in the universities then occupied the positions of leadership. They become the professors in the universities to teach the next generation. I mean, if you ask yourself, where did all the hippies go? What happened to peace, love, lentil soup, and a VW camper van? Well, they all disappeared into the universities. Many of them. And then those students then become the cultural leaders, right, in different spheres, medicine, law, politics, and so on. And why would it then be a shock that they are giving shape to the culture? So that's basically how it happened. And I would say that one of the issues that we do need to address in our time is especially as Christians, is a deprivileging of a so-called intellectual class. It's not that education isn't important. I mean, I'm a Christian intellectual, I'm a Christian apologist, but that doesn't make me more valuable or more important than your everyday Christian who needs to hold me accountable to the Word of God. So we need to recover a Christian way of thinking about the totality of life and stop thinking that the right route for every single student is to end up in $80,000, $100,000 worth of debt, which you've just paid for to have your child made into a radical progressive. We need to think about that. There's another question somewhere here. I think this lady, yeah.
Well, there's a thought out there of amongst Christians of live and let live. I talk to people Christians who have had that idea, like we'll just mind our own business as Christians and let the culture
go its own way,
do its own thing. The problem is that, and I've been conscious of this lately, is that if you have that view of kind of abdicating or withdrawing, should I say, someone will come into that gap and force you to do things you don't want to do, or it won't be. You will soon be in the position where that withdrawal will not be good enough for you.
Yeah, in the next session, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But just to say, you think about how false a statement like that is: live and let live. The Bible says the wages of sin is what? Death. It's not life. So if you leave people to their own devices, in terms of the gospel, say, well, we'll just mind our own business, keep ourselves to ourselves. That's not letting people live. That's letting people die. It's actually saying that the commandment that God gives us to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second Jesus said is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. Doesn't have any meaning. For us to abdicate, remember what I said yesterday, that culture is only the public expression of the worship of a people. It's religion externalized. Now, if that's true, what that statement really means that people are making is, I don't care that people are idolaters. I don't care that people worship other gods. They can go to hell in a handbasket. I don't care. That's what it actually means. Because culture is only people's applied beliefs. It's the application of their worship. And when people's hearts are turned to Jesus Christ, it of necessity alters culture. So if we say, well, we're just going to live and let live, we're living a lie. We're actually saying they can die as far as we're concerned. We don't care. Second of all, there's the implicit dualism that I spoke about in this lecture there. There's a two-story view of the world. It's basically saying, we'll keep ourselves to ourselves because our Christianity is merely a spiritual thing about heaven and the soul and so forth. They can do what they want, right? This is what's important up here. So it doesn't really matter what goes on down here. And then suddenly, with that kind of attitude, people are in the gulag or the concentration camp or the German church, the German evangelical church tries to develop the Reich Church during Hitler's rise to power. Are we that stupid that we believe that anti-Christian ideologies can't arise again anywhere at any time? Germany was one of the most highly developed cultures in the world. And anti-Christian ideology took root, transformed vast swathes of the church. And it was the confessing church part of the evangelical church there with their Barmen Declaration that had people like Bonhoeffer in it that resisted tyranny and said, no, Jesus is Lord, not the Führer. So, but you can see the idea there is that the world doesn't matter, culture doesn't matter, creation doesn't really matter. They can do whatever they like. Perhaps it's neutral, and we'll just join in where we can. But it's not. Every aspect of life, all of life is religion. Every single aspect of life is informed by a religious world and life view. And somebody's morals, somebody's ideas are informing education, law, medicine. Someone's doing it, not no one. So if it's not Christ and his word that's giving shape to cultural life, it's some other word, some other incantation that we've just talked about. So you're absolutely right. The idea that we can just say, well, live and let live, you're basically saying, no, we'll live, you die. And we'll live in this spiritual plane up here, but we don't really care about creation and the rest of the world and culture. It doesn't matter. It's not important to God. That's a lie. Last question, because I need to let you have your break. It's 11 o'clock. Yeah.
Okay, so in line with what you're speaking about now, and you used a couple very distinct examples of the things that are changing within Canada specifically, like the two things out west, where parents themselves, not just, the neighbor, are actually under direct attack of being penalized through the law for not conforming to the cultural society changes that we're experiencing. So I think as a Christian, when you're desirous to share through this renewing or recovering of the mind, the threat is almost paralyzing
Mm-hmm.
because you know that the consequences are pretty severe now.
Yeah.
So I think I'm looking for tools, specific tools. Like you said, we can't just use like a number of 3 specific questions to answer. We need to be equipped, and that is coming obviously with the recovering of the Christian mind. But at the same time, you still have to have kind of a guideline to go by because of these very threats that we're facing.
Yeah. So, yes, the reality of the situation is that a faithful Christian confession is going to start costing us something again. I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next session. But I work with an organization, well, actually, I work with a number of organizations around the world, with ADF in America and with Christian Concern in the UK. Christian Concern has a Christian legal center, and they are dealing with dozens and dozens and dozens of court cases every single year of Christians losing their jobs, basically being fired, being silenced, being suspended, and so on, for what we would consider unbelievable things. For example, a doctor was just struck off in the UK, a Christian doctor, for refusing to call a 6'2" bearded man a woman. And at his tribunal, when his case was heard, the tribunal actually said, and this made the National Compost the National Post in the US. They actually said that when his appeal was the fact that he's a Christian, and the Word of God says God made them male and female, and that this was the foundation of an understanding of human identity in the West. The tribunal said that the Bible was an assault on human rights. And so that kind of thing, there's a professional cost right away there for that doctor. Now, he was willing to pay it, and this is being appealed. The CMDS here have been in the courts over the conscience rights of doctors, right, to not have to refer people for death. So there is going to now be, it's going to sort out, as we say, the men from the boys. There is going to be a sifting in the life of the church as to who is actually ready to stand for Christ and who is going to, you see, Edmund Burke, the great English parliamentarian, contemporary of William Wilberforce, is reputed to have said, all that it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And if we don't speak out and articulate a Christian view and defend a Christian view, we will soon lose all our rights to speak it. The big threat that lawyers are talking about now, and this came out, if any of you are watching any of the Democratic debates in the US, for the Democratic Party, that sort of conga line of interesting individuals, they were basically saying in their primaries there that Christian organizations and institutions, including churches, that do not bow to the inclusive LGBTQ agenda will lose their charitable status. Now, that is a very, very real possibility here in Canada, has been for a number of years. Some of you may be aware of the summer jobs fiasco, where Justin Trudeau introduced basically a heresy test for getting government grants for students for summer jobs, and organizations which didn't fall in. And I was meeting with some heads of universities here in Ontario, Christian universities just in Ontario recently, saying that even again this year, bureaucrats went on their website, this is a chartered university, said, no, you can't have the grants, we don't like your website, we don't like the things that are on it. Now that's a heresy court, that's an orthodoxy test by the state for taxpayers. So there is a big question. I mean, when I'm speaking in Canada now, I have mainline evangelical churches afraid of my coming to their church because they are nervous that somebody says something or reports something, or the press get hold of one of my titles or whatever, that there could be intimidation, threats, charitable status issues, and so on. That's going to become more and more the case. And so the question will become, do we want to be a confessing church or do we want to be a Reich church? That will be the choice for the church going forward. So this is a serious time for the life of the church. That's why a root and branch reformation in the life of the church in terms of a Christian mind is needed. That's why the Ezra Institute is devoting its time and resources and energy to young people. With our high school programs and our professional and student programs. Because they have to get firm, they have to understand all of this and get rooted and grounded in a Christian mind, because it will cost them something. See, we've had the luxury, if we're sort of 60 plus today, we've had the luxury of, the cottage in Muskoka and the speedboat and, our comfortable local church and so on, and golf. We've had that luxury. My children aren't going to have that luxury. They're not. It's going to cost them something. And we have to prepare them for the potential cost of that if the current trajectory continues. Now, by the grace of God, if the church wakes up, there's still a lot of us. If the church actually spoke with a consistent voice, imagine that. If the churches, the evangelical churches, even across this time, what are they going to do? Throw us all in prison? I don't think so. But it's isolated individuals, you see, that get picked off. A little Christian school here out in the boonies in the middle of nowhere that gets a human rights case or whatever. Different individuals get picked off, and the church doesn't speak boldly with clarity and one voice into these issues. And that's what's going to be needed. And as we're faithful, even with our own children, I believe we can turn the tide, but it's going to take sacrifice and it's going to cost us something. Speaking of that, so that I don't cost you the rest of your break, let's have a break now, and we'll come back for our workshops.